Hello, hello, and welcome to another crochet pattern tutorial. I am here to show you how to make your very own pair of the Plebius fingerless gloves. And I'm very excited about this project because it is actually my first ever lace weight crochet project, and it was so much fun to work. I had a little bit of worry about, like what it might be working with lace weight yarn, but I quickly realized, oh, there was absolutely no issue. Like it works up super nicely. It's super fun to do, and it creates such a beautiful, soft, lightweight fabric that I didn't even know crochet was capable of doing, but it absolutely is. So that's a lot of why I'm very excited to show you how to make this. Now, I will say that this is not a full step-by-step instruction video. It is a tutorial video to go alongside the written pattern. So if you would like to get a copy of this pattern, feel free to check out the link in the description box below. So before we actually get started on the techniques for making the gloves, we need to talk about the supplies. So first off, to work a lace weight project, we're going to need some lace weight yarn. So I have here some Merino Lace Light. It's by HiKoo. And what I love about this is that this is a 100% non-superwash merino wool, and it is super soft, super squishy, very smooth, but still has that slight woolly texture. And it's very, very thin, very lightweight, and it creates such a warm but very light fabric. The specs for it is that it is 100 grams and it's 1,400 meters per 100 grams, which in US terms is, I think, about 1,561 yards. So you're getting a lot of yarn in this single skein. Now, the thing is, because this is 1,400 meters, it is on the much lighter side of lace weight. So if you're looking for a lace weight yarn, to compare to this, you'll definitely want to make sure that you're looking to see that it has the same yardage or close to the same yardage, because there are going to be some lace weights that might be, like about 800 yards or 800 meters. Those are going to be a little thicker than what this is. So definitely try to make sure you get one that's comparable to this. Or if you want to get this exact same skein, you can always check out the link in my description box below. I got this at my local yarn shop, Little Tabby Yarn Co., and she also sells her things online. So you'll definitely be able to get yourself a skein of this if you want this exact same one. Now, with that, we're also going to need a hook, of course. So I used my size B 2.25 millimeter hook. Now, this hook is on the mid to larger size of working with lace weight. So you may wind up that if you want to match my gauge, you might need to go down into the steel hook sizes, such as like a 1.7 or a 1.5. But regardless of what hook size you use, the most important part is to make sure that you're matching the gauge. So when you're getting your yarn and getting your hook, I strongly recommend doing a gauge swatch of single crochets worked in rounds. So this project is worked in continuous rounds in the same direction without any turning. And I found that with single crochets, if I work in rows back and forth versus working in rounds continuously, my single crochets in rounds are much tighter than my single crochets worked in rows. So when you make your gauge swatch for this, definitely work your gauge in the round. So with all the information about the yarn and the hook and the gauge, it's time now for your other tools that you're going to need for this project. So you're going to need a yarn needle and some scissors, because even though this will actually be a seamless project, you are going to have some yarn ends that you are going to need to weave in. So definitely make sure you get yourself a small needle and some scissors to help with that. The other thing I have here are stitch markers. You're going to need 2 of them. I have them in unique colors because one is going to be the beginning of round stitch marker, and the other one will just represent where I do my increases for shaping. So you're going to need 2 stitch markers for those 2 purposes. Another thing I don't have pictured here are blocking mats and blocking pins. I found that I just needed to wash my gloves and they fit me just fine. They were the shape I wanted. But you may find that when you make your gloves, even after washing, you might want to shape them to fit your hand a certain way. So if you want to, you can feel free to wet block or steam block using blocking mats and blocking pins. So you can check out the description box below for all links to any of these tools, and you can be able to, get those and have everything that you need to be able to make your own gloves. So now that I've talked at length about the yarn, the hook, the tools, the gauge, everything like that, it is time for us to stop talking about the project and actually get started. So let's go. To begin our gloves, we're going to start with the ribbing of the cuff that goes around the wrist. To do that, we're just going to take our hook and our yarn. We're going to create a slip knot and then place that knot on our hook. Now, I'm not going to lie, given how light and thin this yarn is and how small the hook is, this part can be a bit fiddly when we start because there's just not a whole lot to grab onto. So the key to this is just to be very slow and patient for the first couple of rows as you're working. And then once that is established, it will be much easier to actually work subsequent rows. So just take this part very slowly. I've had to restart a couple of times myself. So if you find yourself doing that, don't worry. That is part of the process. All right. But eventually you will get it. So to start with, we're going to chain the number of chains listed in the pattern, or you can adjust these chains depending on how wide you want the cuff of your glove to be. But in either case, for all sizes, we're going to chain loosely so then that way we can work easily into them later. A common mistake when working with thin yarn like this is to accidentally pull too tight and then you can't get your hook into the stitch later. All right. Now that I'm finished working my chains, I'm ready to begin my row 1, which is just single crocheting in all the chains across, starting with the second chain from my hook. So if I look here, you can see my first chain is going to be this one right here from my hook. So that one, I'm just going to kind of tighten down so I don't work into it on accident. And then I'm going to start with this second one and just work a single crochet into that one. Now I want to keep these single crochets relatively relaxed as well, because we will be working in them later. And just like I said with the chains, if it's too tight, it's very difficult to get our hook into them. Once I work my single crochet in the second chain, I will then work a single crochet into every chain across. All right, one more, and there we go. So my first row, I made 12 total single crochets. So I want to make sure that it stays 12 single crochets now and throughout. So one thing that I might do to help me with that is if, a common problem for crocheters is missing those first and last stitches. So you can always grab a stitch marker and be able to put them into those first and last stitches to make sure you always catch those. So I'll show you how to do that here by doing a chain 1, turning my work, and now I'm ready to begin row 2, which is going to be our established stitch pattern for the remainder of our ribbing. So in the very first single crochet, we're just going to crochet it like normal. Now, one thing to note is that I've got this chain here that's a little bit big and loose. That is not the stitch that I want to work into. I'm wanting to work into the actual single crochet itself. And to work into that single crochet, I'm going to find that kind of hole that's kind of right here above this big loose chain and insert my hook under both loops of the V that's on top. Once I do that, I then complete my single crochet. And then I can go ahead and take a stitch marker and place it under both loops of the stitch that I just made. So that way, when I come back down this row, I will see exactly where my last stitch is going to be. Okay, there we go. It's under both loops. So that's now marked for me for the future. Now that I've worked my first single crochet under both loops, what I'm going to do to create my ribbing is actually work single crochets in the back loop only for the next middle set of stitches here, but not into the very last one. So for the next, for me, 10 stitches, I'm going to work in just the back loops only. So once again, if I look at the tops of my stitches, I can see they have these V's along here. The one that is closest to me is the loop that's called the front loop, and the one that's farthest away is the back loop. So the one I want to work into is the one farthest away from me. So I'm going to insert my hook through just the back loop of my next single crochet. And there we go. Once it's through that back loop, I then complete my single crochet just like normal. And then repeat that across in all the other stitches except the last one. Oh, I only went through one ply. So as you can see, just like I said before, this part can be a little fiddly, but if you're really patient with yourself and just take your time, reorienting your work and your hook to make it as easy as possible for yourself, then you'll be good to go. All right, coming now towards the end. So I'm going to work these last couple of single crochets through the back loop only, but then I'm not going to work in just the back loop of this last single crochet. Instead, I'm going to work under both loops just like I did with the very first one. Then once I do that, I'll then turn, chain one, and repeat what I just did for row 2 for all of my other rows. So as a reminder on how to do that, we're going to work under both loops of the first single crochet that we have right here. Again, it's not going to be the one that's this big loose one right here. That was the one we just worked into. The one I just made is up here, right here. So if I kind of stretch it, I can see that it's this top loop that I need to work into, or top set of loops. Oops. All right. So now that I've inserted under both loops there, I can finish my single crochet. And just so I can make sure I mark that stitch, I'm going to grab my stitch marker and place it under both loops of that very first single crochet that I created. Sorry, let me get my hook out of the way. So let me find those 2 loops here. Get that stitch marker under both of those loops, and there we go. Nice and marked. And now I have the first and last stitch of my row marked. You don't have to do that if you're able to confidently find your first and last stitch without needing stitch markers, then you can just skip that part. That's just a tip for those of us who might struggle to find our first and last stitches, especially when working with this small yarn like this. All right, so once I've done my first stitch in both loops, I'm then going to work in back loops only across to the last stitch. So finding my next single crochet here, I'm going to work through just the back loop. and single crochet. And then keep doing that across. All right, I'm coming now to my last couple of back loop only single crochets. And now I'm to my very last single crochet. So because I used a stitch marker, it actually makes it a lot easier for me to be able to get my hook under both of those loops because the stitch marker is already through both of the loops. So what I can do is kind of use the stitch marker to pull it to get those loops nice and open. And then I'm able to insert my hook into that stitch. Under both loops like that. And then finish my single crochet. Then once I do that, I'm able to chain one, turn my work. Then I can take this stitch marker out so that I can use it when I make the first stitch of my next row. And so I'm going to keep doing that, repeating row 2, working a single crochet in the first stitch under both loops, then under the back loops only across to the last stitch, and then working under both loops single crochet in the very last stitch, and just keep turning and repeating that for the number of rows indicated in the pattern for your size. So I'm going to work up the rest of my cuff, and then I'm going to meet you back to talk about how to join. All right, I've just finished working up all of my rows for my cuff, and we can see here that it's this nice little stretchy ribbing rectangle. So it should definitely stretch plenty to be able to get around our hand. And then it snaps back here to create a nice tight cuff for our wrist. So in order to do the next part where we join the cuff together, we're going to carefully and without twisting our cuff, fold it over and match the last row of our work on top of the chains that we worked into for our first row. So it's going to match up something like this. And the way we're going to join it is going to make it look like it's just a continuation of the ribbing pattern here with all the same ridges. So to do that, we're going to insert our hook into the same places on this last row as we would normally if we were working another row. So we're going to start by inserting our hook under both loops of this first single crochet. There we go. And then we're going to, if we lay it on top, locate the corresponding chain from our first row. So it's going to be this very first one right here. And then once I insert my hook through both loops of my first stitch of my last row and through the chain from my first row, I'm going to yarn over and just slip stitch those together. Once I do that, I then find my next stitch here, which would now be one where I would work in the back loop only. So I'm going to go through just the back loop of the next 10 stitches, but then still insert through the chain and then going behind my work, grabbing my yarn and then slip stitching those together. Now, just like the very beginning, this part can be a bit fiddly, but if you go slowly and patiently, just like before, you will be able to get all of your stitches joined together just like this. So then I'm going to do my next one, go through the back loop of my next stitch. And then find the corresponding stitch, or chain rather, from the first row. Insert my hook, and then going behind the work, I'll grab my yarn and just slip stitch those together. And if you need to do the slip stitch in a couple of steps, like what you just saw me do there, where I pulled it first through the chain, then through the stitch that was on the last row, and then through the loop on my hook, you can do that too. It doesn't really matter, because in the end, all that matters is that you just have the stitches joined nice and neatly. And then I'm just going to keep doing that until all 12 of my stitches are joined. Now, one thing to note is that as we're working down this row, the yarn is starting to go farther and farther behind the work, so it's a little bit more difficult to see. That's okay. All you have to do is just really keep turning your work, and you're always going to be able to see the yarn here on the back. So as long as you can see it on the back, you can grab it, and then once you grab it, turn back around to pull through for your slip stitch. So I'm going to continue working mine down, and then I'll meet you back up to talk about how to then continue to the next step. All right, I've just finished joining up all 12 stitches. And as you can see here, it's a little maybe puckered. I was probably a little too tight in some of my slip stitches, but I'm going to go ahead and just kind of like pinch them and gently stretch them open here and kind of adjust. And there we go. Okay. Now, at this point, what you may note is that the yarn that we are working with is now going through the cuff. So in order for us to start working the actual glove portion, we're going to need the inside of this, or sorry, we're going to need our yarn to no longer be going inside of this cuff. All you have to do to really fix that, rather than try to stretch the cuff and put it over your ball of yarn, is you just do a little flip around. So we're just going to flip and then flip again. And when I do that, the yarn is now on the outside. So it's no longer going through the cuff. It's just out here where I can start working with it for the body. All right. So now that we have the cuff completely set up, we are ready to start working the main body of the glove, which is going to cover the palm portion here. And in order to do that, we're going to work into the sides of our rows. So to start, I'm going to chain one and then work a single crochet into the side of every single row. So the way to kind of note which ones are rows is we kind of look along here and we see these kind of two gaps right here. We have one that's kind of dipped a little bit farther down, and then one that kind of pokes up like this. So we can see along here, we've got a little dip and a ridge, a dip and a ridge. So there's always these kind of like little pokey ones, and in between are these little valleys. And so those are how we can tell the ends of our rows. So for this first one, because I did the last one was kind of like a ridge one, we're going to pretend that that's kind of like a poking out part. We're going to work just a single crochet into that very first stitch. Then once I do that, I'm going to grab my beginning of round stitch marker, which in this case, I'm going to use this dark purpley one. And we're going to insert it under one loop of our stitch. And the reason I only want to do one loop is because I found that when I was working with lace weight yarn, if I used both loops, because of how thick the stitch marker is compared to the yarn, it tended to make the very first stitch really big compared to all the other ones. So it created this kind of little like line, this like gap basically with the bigger stitches. And I just didn't really like that aesthetically. So it's up to you if you want to go ahead and put it under both loops, but my recommendation is doing just one loop to avoid that issue. All right. So once I've done it into this kind of peak, we're going to go into this little valley right here. And this valley is going to be our second stitch. So that's going to be stitch number 2. And then the peak is going to be stitch number 3. And then the valley is number 4. Peak is number 5, and so on and so forth. And you'll find that if you do this correctly, the number of single crochets you will have by the end, when you get all the way back around to your first work or your first stitch, will be the exact same as the number of rows that you had to do for your cuff. So for my case, I need 64 total single crochets. All right, I've come around and I'm now at stitch number 60 and I have 4 more to work and I needed 64, so that works out perfectly. So I'm gonna do 61, 62, 63, and 64. Right there, okay. And now that I'm back around, we are now going to begin working our established stitch pattern, where we're going to be working rows of or rounds of increase and rounds of non-increase. So easily enough, rounds of non-increase are exactly what we just did. So we just work our stitches like normal. And anytime we see a stitch marker, we're just going to take the stitch marker out, work our stitch, and then place the stitch marker in the stitch we just made. But to work our increase rounds, which I'm about to start, we're going to need a second stitch marker. So I'm going to grab my second stitch marker here. And then in the pattern, it tells you which stitch to place it in depending on your size. So for example, for me, I'm going to place mine in the 33rd stitch from the beginning. So I would just count my first 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way until I get 33 and then mark that stitch. And then once that stitch is marked, just like before I would put it in just one of the loops here, I am now ready to begin round 2, where I'm going to be working an increase to start shaping for the thumb. So what I'll do is I'm going to work single crochets without turning. I'm going to be working single crochets into all of these until I reach the last stitch before this stitch marker. So to start, go ahead and take my stitch marker out of my first stitch. Kind of pull those. And we can see that since that stitch marker pulled that loop really big, it also tightened the one in the back. So then when I took it out and kind of stretched it here, it set it right back to where it's just a normal sized single crochet. So working into both loops there, work my first single crochet of the round. Then I'm going to put my stitch marker into that front loop of my first stitch. So I remember that this is the beginning of my new round. All right, there we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and work single crochets until I get to one stitch before the stitch marker. All right, I now have one more single crochet before my stitch marker, and now I'm going to show you how to do the increase like we're normally going to for this pattern, but then I'm also going to show you a more advanced way of increasing called the invisible increase for those of you who maybe want to, level up your crochet skills. So first, to do a regular increase, all we do is just place 2 single crochets into this single crochet before the stitch marker. So we just insert our hook into that single crochet, create our first one, then insert it again into that same single crochet. And there we go, 2 single crochets created. Then in the marked stitch, we're just going to remove it, work a regular single crochet, place the stitch marker back into that stitch, and then on the other side, we're going to do another increase. So in this next stitch, we'll just place 2 single crochets. And that way, it increases this round by 2 stitches, one on either side of this stitch marker. After that, you would just single crochet again into every stitch until you get to the beginning of the round. And then that means that you know now how to do the non-increase and the increase rounds. And then you can continue to work the number of rounds for your size. And if you feel like, okay, that's what I want to do, I don't want to do the advanced type of increase, you can feel free to skip to the next section and find out what to do once you need to get to splitting for the thumb. Okay, so let's say you are wanting to do an invisible increase. What we're going to do is work until we get to these last 2 stitches right before the stitch marker, because how we're going to work in this next stitch is going to help with making sure that our invisible increase is easy to work. So to do the invisible increase, we're actually going to be placing a single crochet between these 2 stitches. So in order to do that, we have to make sure that we are not tightening up this stitch too much right here. So when I work into this stitch, I'm going to work my single crochet under both of these loops, but keep it nice and relaxed. And then complete my single crochet. And then I'm going to kind of pull that stitch to the right here. And if we notice, the two stitches here have their back loops. What I'm going to do is insert my hook through the back loop of the first stitch and the next stitch at the same time. So I'm going to insert through the back loop of this stitch that I just worked into, and then also the back loop of the stitch right before the stitch marker. Sometimes I need to kind of twist and pick it with my hook tip here. And there we go. Okay. So once it's through the back loops of both of those stitches, you'll then yarn over and just pull through both of those loops like one stitch. Then yarn over and pull through two to create your single crochet. And now we can work our next stitch under both loops of the second stitch here. Now, because I did pull the back loop here, it might be a little tight, so we can kind of pull back and relax it a little bit more and kind of find our way. We need to kind of dig underneath both of those loops there. Pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through two. We've now created a more invisible single crochet. So the single crochets, since we're not working two of them into a single stitch, it's not actually stretching one stitch to be bigger than the other one. So just like I was saying earlier with the stitch marker, sometimes stretching out the stitch and making it too big, sometimes putting an increase in the single crochets can also make them a little too big and make it a little bit more noticeable. But if you put it between those two stitches by working through just those two back loops, and then the two single crochets on either side are worked under both loops, it keeps it nice and tight so that it looks just like another single crochet in a row of nice tight single crochets. Once I do that, I then work in the marked stitch just like we did in the previous one. Then we'll go ahead and mark that stitch. And now on the other side, I would be working another increase, but this time I'm not wanting it to increase between this marked stitch and the stitch that's like next to it, because that's not how the other one was. The other one was between the two stitches next to the marked stitch. So I want it to go between these next two stitches. So to do that, I'm going to do my single crochet under both loops of this next stitch. Then I'm going to do my single crochet through both back loops of the current stitch that I just worked into and the next unworked stitch. Once I'm under both loops, I then pull through both of those to create my increase stitch, then complete my single crochet, then go under both loops of the same stitch right here. Might be a little tight. You can just kind of push your hook through it until it's under both loops, pull up a loop, pull through two. And just like before, those will then kind of tighten up. And just like on the other side here, it'll create an increase. So you'll have two new stitches in this round, and then you're able to continue working like normal. So regardless of which increase method you decide to use, whether you just do two single crochets into a stitch or you use this invisible method, the instructions will be the same. You'll simply work alternating increase and non-increase rounds to the number of rounds listed for your size in your pattern. So I'm going to work up the rest of this, and then I'll meet back with you to talk about splitting for the thumb. All right, I just finished working up the increase rounds to shape for the thumb. And now if I were to try this on, it would go basically to right about here where it's going to need a split, where my thumb opening is going to be, and then where the finger section is going to continue to go up a little bit. So to do that, we're going to need to work the next section of the pattern, which is splitting for the thumb. So depending on your size, it's going to tell you to work a certain number of stitches, and then you're going to do a chain, skip over, and then work stitches for the remainder of the round, and then leave a section of this open that we will no longer work, and then that's going to be something we'll join back later to work on for the thumb hole. But regardless of the number of stitches and number of chains, the techniques are going to be the same. So one trick that I do so that I don't have to count a bunch of stitches is I no longer need this increase stitch marker. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. And I'm going to actually use that to mark where I'm going to stop working stitches that it says for my size, and then do my chain. And then I'm going to take a second stitch marker and mark where I'm going to skip around so that I know exactly where I join on the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Alrighty, I have now marked the two places that indicate where I'm going to be separating for the thumb. And so that way I don't have to count as I work my stitches. Instead, I can just single crochet to this marker, skip around to the stitch after this marker, and then continue on my way. So to begin the first split round, we're going to start by working just single crochets like normal. So I'm going to take my beginning of round stitch marker out, work my first single crochet of the round, place my beginning of round stitch marker back in there because we're going to continue working in these continuous rounds, and then just single crochet into every stitch until I reach my stitch marker. All right, I'm coming now to where I'm close to this marked stitch. And then once I get here, that means I've now worked the single crochets that I needed for my size, and I'm ready to do my chain and skip around until I get to the opposite side here. So the chain is going to be dependent on your size, but it's worked the same way for all sizes. You're going to chain loosely like we did earlier for our cuff ribbing, so that way we can be able to work into these chains later. All right. Once I do my chain, I then skip around until I get to this stitch after my stitch marker. And because I counted out how many I needed to skip, that made sure I didn't have to count this second time. So now I can just insert my hook into this next single crochet, pull up a loop, and then trying to keep my tension nice and even here, I'll go ahead and yarn over and pull through both of those loops. And then that'll start as my first single crochet of this side. And that means that you should now have a number of chains depending on your size. And then on the front side of the glove or the back side, whichever one, but on opposite sides of your glove, they should now be the same number of single crochets. So if your size is like, you'll work, 35 single crochets or something like that, then you'll skip the next 25 or something. Then on the other side, you should have 35 single crochets just like you did before you skipped around to the thumb. So that can kind of help you with counting the stitches and making sure you've got it right. Now, if you find though that you're working this and you don't have exactly the right number on both sides, like maybe you're off by one or two, you could double check that you did skip the right amount, you actually worked the right amount. Sometimes it can be easy in some of these smaller stitches to miss them. But if you find that you're just still off by that, you can always just throw in an increase somewhere where you need it. So like I might throw it somewhere kind of in the middle, halfway between, or somewhere near where the thumb opening was. I might just put a random one in here just to kind of hide an increase. Or if you have too many, you can actually do a decrease, which I will be showing how to do decreases, like 2 different techniques for it later in the video. And you can definitely apply those here if you find that you have too many stitches. But regardless, Once you have the correct number of stitches all the way around for this first split round, you're then going to be ready to start working subsequent rounds. So I'm going to go ahead and work the rest of this round off camera, and then I'll meet you back to talk about round 2 of splitting. For the second round, I've actually gone ahead and worked through the first several stitches here because that part has not changed. I just have a few more stitches left before we reach the chain that we use to skip across to form our thumb opening. And so I'm going to show you how to work across the chain and back around to the other single crochets on the opposite side. So if you notice here, I've still got my stitch marker in this stitch right here. So that's going to be one that we no longer are working into. So instead, we're going to continue working in rounds across this chain here. And I have 4 more stitches left to work before the chain begins. So I'm just going to work those first 4 single crochets like normal. Then when I reach my chain, I can kind of orient it however I feel most comfortable. So it really does not matter how you work into this chain, as long as you do the same number of single crochets as you had chains. So for example, I had a chain of 10 going across here. So that means I just need to work 10 single crochets across this chain, one ideally in each chain across. Now, if I come over here to the other side, based on the structure of our stitches, my very first single crochet that's worked into the actual stitches on this side of the glove starts right here. If we see those little legs that are kind of right there, that means the stitch is going to be this one right here. So this is the first stitch worked on this side. So that means my 10 stitches have to be worked all before that stitch. So as long as I make sure I'm doing exactly 10 across here, and then my next stitch after those 10 is worked into this single crochet, all the other single crochets are worked like normal across, I will be at the right stitch count. So for me, what I'm going to do is kind of orient the chain, kind of like just twisting it until it kind of flattens like the way I want to here. And I'll start with my first stitch right in this chain. So I'm just going to go under both loops of this chain and create the first of 10 single crochets. And then continuing in that, going to insert my hook into this next chain. There's number 2. Then again into the next one, there's 3. Then the next one, 4. Oops, I split my yarn there. 4. And you can see now why it was important to make sure we worked these loosely, because if these were really tight chains, it would be a pain trying to get my hook into them right now. All right, I'm kind of getting to a little bit of a tough part here, but I now have my 10 chains worked across, and I'm here to this single crochet. If I find that maybe I didn't have enough space or something like that, that is okay. You can always go ahead and just work 2 single crochets into one of your chains, and it will not really be that noticeable. So it's a very forgiving thing. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that since I do have my 10. And then I'm going to work my single crochet into this stitch right here as the first stitch on the other side. And then work a single crochet into the next stitch. And then continuing that all the way back to the beginning of the round. So then I'll have my single crochets around the front part here, single crochets across each chain, and then single crochets around the back part until the beginning. And that's all there is to doing the second round. So I'm going to go ahead and complete that, and then I'll meet you back to talk about the remaining rounds of this section. I have now finished working the second round, so I've worked all the way across and across my chain and all the way around the back. And now that I've established all of these single crochets, I actually am ready to do the remaining part of the split section, which is just working a certain number of rounds depending on your size without any increasing, decreasing, any shaping whatsoever. It's just basically once it um, gets up to about this height here, it's going to be ready for us to split and start working the finger openings. So basically what you have left is just some nice crocheting in the round without any thinking. You just make sure you keep track of rows. But even still, if you don't want to do the exact number of rounds, you just want to get up to where it matches just below your base of your fingers right here, then you can customize that length to whatever length you really want it to be. Another thing is that now that we've split the thumb, we actually no longer need these stitch markers because we now have these single crochets established. So we're not going to accidentally work into those stitches. So I can go ahead and set those aside so they're not just jangling all over the place. All right, so now that we know what we're doing for the remaining part of this section of the glove, I'm gonna go ahead and work up my part off camera, and then I'll meet you back to start talking about how to start splitting for our finger openings. All right, I've just finished working up all the rounds for the split for the thumb, and I'm now ready to begin working the finger openings, starting with our pinky opening right here. So in the pattern, it's going to tell you to count back a certain number of stitches from the beginning of round stitch marker, and then marking that stitch. So I've got my second stitch marker here, and I've got my first marked stitch here. The one that I just finished is the first one from there. So there's 1, 2, 3, etc. And I'm going to count back the number for my size. So to begin with, you're going to be working just single crochets for the number of stitches that it states for your size in the pattern. So for me, that's going to be the same number as the ones that I just counted back from the beginning of round stitch marker here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that beginning of round marker, work my first single crochet, replace that beginning of round stitch marker, and then just continue working the stitches that I need. In this case, I'm doing 13 single crochets. Once I work those single crochets, I'm now ready to create a chain that's going to skip across to our marked stitch, just like when we split for the thumb. And the chain here is going to be the exact same amount of chains as we did when we split for the thumb. So that's actually going to be exactly the same as what we did earlier. So that should be nice and easy. Working those chains loosely so I can work into them later. And then I'm going to skip across to this marked stitch here. And then in that marked stitch, I'm going to work my next single crochet. Once I have my hook inserted, I can go ahead and actually take my stitch marker out. I won't need that for now. Okay, there we go. Single crochet made. And then I just continue single crocheting until I get back to the beginning of round stitch marker. All right, once I'm back to the beginning of the round here, the next one is just to work a round of single crochets around the stitches and the chains, just like we did earlier when we were working the split for the thumb, just on a much smaller scale for this pinky opening. So I'll go ahead and remove my stitch marker, work my first single crochet, place my stitch marker back in there, and then work until I get to the chain, and then I'm able to work across the chain. All right, and just like before, I've got one final single crochet here before I start working into the chain. So I'm going to work that single crochet, And then I'm just going to make sure that I try to work into each chain across. But even if for some reason there's a chain that's a little tight and so I can't quite find it or I lose it or something, as long as I have the same number of single crochets as I do chains, I'll be all good on this section. So I'm going to find here this first one, go ahead and work into that first chain. To the best of my abilities. Okay, I see it. It's right there. There we go. Okay. So there's my first one. And then my second one should be right here. And then I'll just work all 10 of my single crochets, one for each chain. I just finished working around the chain. It did take me a little bit of time to get into everything, but I was able to get all 10 single crochets across here and then work the remaining single crochets around to the beginning of the round. And now I'm ready to begin the next round, round 3, which is going to be a decrease round because the base of the fingers are spread out a little bit here. And so we want to make sure we decrease to kind of cinch in the fingers so then that way they fit a little bit more snugly. So for the pinky, I found that we needed to do a double decrease round. So I'm going to show you how we do that here. In the pattern, it's going to list exactly the number of stitches you work and then when you do your decreases. But regardless of your size and the number of stitches you do before you work a decrease, the decreasing method is going to be the same. And just like with increasing, there are going to be 2 methods I'm showing. The first one is going to be the quote unquote basic method. So that's the one actually listed in the pattern. But then I'm going to show you a more advanced technique for a more invisible looking decrease. So first off, I'm going to work my first few stitches that I would do for my size. Then I would decrease across the next 2 stitches. And I'm going to do that by working a single crochet 2 together is the basic version. So to do a single crochet 2 together, you insert your hook into the first stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop. Then before you complete that single crochet, you insert your hook into the next stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop. Now that we have those 3 loops on our hook, we're going to yarn over and pull through all 3. And that basically turns 2 stitches into a single stitch. So that decreases it by 1. Now, if I do my next decrease, I'm going to show that by doing the invisible decrease. So if you want to try to level up your skill here, you can do an invisible decrease by inserting through a different part of the stitch, and you're only going to be working 1 single crochet across these 2. So we're not doing a single crochet 2 together. We're doing 1 single crochet. It's just going to be worked somehow into both of these stitches. And it's very similar to when we did the increase by going through the back loops only of the 2 stitches here just to set a stitch in between. This time, we're actually going to go through these 2 front loops. So I'm going to insert my hook through the front loop of my next stitch. Then turn my hook and insert it through the front loop of the next stitch. Once I do that, I will then yarn over and pull through both of those loops, and then yarn over and pull through 2 to complete my single crochet. And what this does and why it's really good for making what's called an invisible decrease is because by going through the 2 front loops, you're actually creating a mock single crochet with those 2 front loops. So it looks just like all the other single crochet holes right here. And it's not creating 2 posts or any kind of bulk or anything like that, like the single crochet 2 together can do. And so it's a little bit just better at hiding your decrease right here. And then once you do that, you're able to move on by working your next single crochets just like normal. And then that just kind of creates that nice little hidden decrease. So then you just keep working the number of single crochets listed for your size until you get to the next decrease. And then you could either choose to do the single crochet 2 together or the invisible decrease where we work through those first 2 front loops or those next 2 front loops here. Oh my goodness. I am having some trouble today, it looks like. Okay, there we go. Just gonna, there we go. Okay. And pull through both of those, and there we go. And so regardless of whichever one you do, this round you're going to work the number of stitches that it lists and then any decreases that it lists, and then you're going to get all the way back around to the beginning of the round. Now, after that, it's just a matter of working crochets until you get up to the length that you want on the finger. So for me, I did just enough rounds to where it goes up to right about where the knuckle is. And then once I hit that knuckle area, you then just finish off with a round of slip stitches. So I'm going to work up the rest of my pinky, and then I'm going to come back and show you that round of slip stitches. I have just finished working up the amount of the pinky coverage that I want on my glove, and I'm ready to begin the final round, which is just a round of slip stitches to kind of cinch it in a bit so that it fits snug around the finger and minimizes the amount of air that can get into your finger opening. So to do that, I'm going to remove my beginning of round stitch marker again. And then into my first stitch, I'm going to just work a slip stitch, and I'm not going to do this too tight or too loose. I'm just going to kind of have a normal relaxed tension. Just slip stitch that. And then I'm going to go ahead and mark that first slip stitch with my stitch marker. And then I'm just going to slip stitch the same way into every stitch around. So insert my hook, yarn over, and just pull through. Go into my next single crochet, slip stitch, and then into the next one, and just keep doing that until I get back around to the beginning of the round stitch marker. All right, I'm coming here to the end. Got a few more slip stitches to work until I reach the very last stitch before the beginning of round stitch marker. All right. Once I do that, I can actually go ahead and remove this stitch marker entirely since I'm actually done working rounds on this finger opening. Go ahead and grab my scissors here and snip off a little tail for me to weave in. And then once I snip that, I just pull the yarn through. And then to finish this off, I'm going to actually do an invisible join, which is a technique oftentimes you'll see in like amigurumi, or when you finish off like anything in the round in crochet. We want to mimic the top of our stitches, which is just this little V right here. We're going to do that same thing by creating that same V into this first slip stitch. So to do that, I'm going to first thread my yarn through my yarn needle here. All right. And then if we see here, the yarn, it's a little tiny, but if we just check here, the yarn is coming out of the very last slip stitch through the center of the V that's on the top there. And then since it's coming out of the center, we need it to wrap around the V of this slip stitch and then go back through the center to look like all these other V's that are going through here. So I'll find the V of this first slip stitch here, insert my needle. It doesn't really matter if you go right to left or left to right, but you'll go in, kind of gently pull it, and then insert your needle down through the center of the V of our last slip stitch. And then pull it through. And what that does is it creates a little mock top of a stitch. And so it just is a nice little invisible join. It gets rid of the jog from having like worked continuous rounds and how one round will kind of look a little bit taller than the other one. This helps even that out. And then what you can do is you're free to either just take the yarn needle off and deal with the weaving in the ends later, or you could go ahead and weave in your end if you want to just get that out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and weave my end in just to show you my technique for how I weave in ends. One thing is that I'll try to either work it like on the wrong side, or if I do work it on the right side, I'm able to hide it pretty well. Let's see here. Let's try here just on the inside. It just need a little bit there. So the technique I like to use is the back fourth, or sorry, it doesn't really have like an official name, but I like to just kind of go forward, backward, and forward again. So what that means is that we're going to find just some series of stitches that we'll just insert our needle through. And then I'm going to pull the yarn through going that one direction. Don't want to pull it too tight. I just want to make sure it gets in there. Okay. Then I'm going to turn and pass the needle with the yarn back through that same place after I grab a loop from another stitch nearby, just to kind of wrap it around so it doesn't come loose. And then go back through under those same stitches. And then I can pull it through again. Once again, not pulling too tight, just enough to kind of get it nice and snug there. And then usually 2 is going to be plenty, but sometimes I'm just a little paranoid. So I go ahead and do maybe a 3rd pass if it's not going to make it too thick. If I was with like a bulky weight yarn or a worsted weight yarn, it might be a little thick doing it this way, but since we're working with a lace weight, I think it'll be light enough that a 3rd pass won't be too thick. So I'll go ahead and do that one. And there's no real like specific way of doing that. You just find loops that make sense for you to stick your needle through, and that's good enough. And there we go. And so that is how I like to weave in my ends so that they're nice and secure, but I don't have to do a whole bunch of zigzagging or anything like that. It's just foof, 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 and then it's nice and secure. Set my needle aside, grab my scissors, and then snip off that excess tail. Then when we go to wash and block it and everything, that will just stay nice and secure inside our stitches there. And that is how we finish off the finger opening. Now that's going to be how we finish off the finger opening for all of the fingers and the thumb. So I'm not going to review that every single time I show the next finger opening, but so if you do need to, you can come back to this part of the video to remind you how to do this part. But for the next part, I'm going to go ahead and show how to join and begin working the rest of these finger openings, including the thumb, because the technique for them is going to be the exact same thing. So I'm going to begin that demo in the next section. To add the other finger openings and the thumb, we're going to do basically the exact same technique. I'm going to first locate the chain that I used on the previous finger and find the halfway point. And then if I'm right-handed, I'm going to insert my hook into the middle chain on the left. And if I'm left-handed, since I'm going to be going this way, I would be finding the one to the right. So in either case, you're going to pick the center chain. that's just like, because there's going to be two center ones, you're going to pick the one that's going to count as your first stitch. So for me, that's going to be, I think, right about here. Okay. All right. And then from here, I'm going to join my yarn. So I'm going to grab the yarn that I fastened off from earlier, leave a bit of a tail so I can weave it in. And I just join by grabbing it with my hook, pulling it through, and then I just chain one to secure it. There we go. Now, the number of single crochets that I'm going to be working into the chains here is going to be half of the total number of my chain from before. So in my case, because I had a chain 10, I will be working 5 single crochets here at the beginning, and then work 5 single crochets across here when I get back around to the end. So this next part, just like what we did with the pinky opening, is very critical that I'm counting back the 5 here, the 5 chains here, plus the ones I need to count back what it says for my size. So in my case, it says to count back 13. And so I'm going to take my little stitch marker here. I'm going to count back 13. So that's going to be 5 chains here. And then if I look along the side here, I need to locate my first unworked single crochet. So if I look, I can see that this single crochet right here has something coming out of it. So there's this single crochet, has this chain coming out of it. So this one was actually already worked into from when I did my first pinky round. So then my first unworked one is actually this single crochet right here. So I'm going to count 5, and then I need to count 13 total. So I need 8 more of these single crochets starting right here. If you have some trouble finding it, you can always leave maybe like some stitch markers in the ones that you worked or ones that were left unworked. You can do that for your own visual purposes. But for me, I just look to see what has been worked in and then look for the one that has not been worked in quite yet. So there's that one. So I'm going to count back 8 more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then that one's going to be where I place my stitch marker. Right in there. Okay. And now I'll begin by working a single crochet into the same chain that I just joined into. So into that same chain here, it's going to be a single crochet. And then I'm going to mark that single crochet with my beginning of round stitch marker. This is a very fiddly process. So as you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on. If you go slowly and patiently with this, just like a lot of the beginning parts of this glove. But then once we get it established, it does become much easier. Okay, there we go. So I've got that first single crochet completed. And now I've got 4 more to work across my chain. You'll just work however many for your chain, depending on your size. So then I'll have a total of 5 single crochets worked across the chain. Okay. Once I get to that 5th one for me, it is now time for me to begin working into the unworked stitches along here. So for me, it's going to be 8 stitches or 8 single crochets across these 8 single crochets. But if I notice here in this corner, we can see that the next unworked stitch is way over here because this is the one that was worked with this stitch right in here. So this is my first one. So if I went straight there and tried to work a single crochet into that single crochet, it's going to leave kind of this big gap right here in the corner. And I really want to try to avoid that as much as possible. You can always try to tighten it up or sew it up with some yarn later. But for me, I go ahead and deal with that right now by covering it with some single crochets together. So just like with a decrease, we can insert our hook into some random spots here around the corner, pull up a loop, go into another random spot here and pull up another loop. And then I'm now to my first unworked stitch. I can insert my hook, pull up a loop. And now when I have all these loops on my hook, I yarn over and just pull through all of those. And it creates a more solid stitch. So it doesn't create that big wide opening gap like it would have if I had just gone straight into that stitch. So that's a good technique for any time you're moving around the corner of something in crochet, is if you don't want to increase your stitch count by adding a bunch of stitches into the corner, you can just do single crochet 2, 3, 4 together, however many you need. And it just swoops through that corner and just creates one stitch. And so now that I've done that, I can go ahead and work the remainder of my stitches. So I need to do 7 more here. Then once I do that, I am ready to split across, just like I did with the pinky. I'm going to do the same chain that I did for the pinky opening. So in this case, I'm going to chain 10, nice and loose. And then cut across to where I marked my stitch over here. I'm going to work my next single crochet into that marked stitch, which I can go ahead and remove that just so it's not in my way. Then I will single crochet into these stitches around here. Okay. And I'm about to work my 8th stitch, which is going to be this one right here. And then I'll be back into the corner again. So I'm going to work my 8th stitch there. And then I'm ready to start working my final stitches across the chain. So just like on the other side, if I want to work into these 5 chains here, 1, 2, 3, 4, they're a little difficult to see, but I know that I do need to work 5 stitches here. There's going to be a jump again here. So I'm going to do the exact same technique over here as I did in the first corner, where when I work my first single crochet into this first chain here, I'm actually going to start by inserting my hook into a couple of these random spots and just pulling up loops until I get to that first chain. I think might not even need to do that many loops. Hold on, let me see. Got 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, 5. Okay, so I didn't need to do as many loops on this one. So you can do an extra one just somewhere in here if you really feel the need to. I don't really, I'm okay with just like, as long as it's covering it, that's what really matters. So I've got that one, and then I've got 2, oh wait, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And there we go. And now I'm back to my beginning of round. And so I will continue working this finger opening exactly the same as I did this one. So the next round is just going to be working single crochets around the stitches that I've made and the chain. And then the round after that is going to be a decrease round. And I've already shown how to do decreases on the pinky opening. And what's even better is that once I work this finger opening up to the length that I want, the middle finger is exactly worked the same way. So everything you need for the next 2 fingers is already stuff that you've seen. So you can go ahead and work these next 2 finger openings. And if you need any support for them, you can always go back and just watch the pinky section again, because everything that we do in the pinky section is exactly the same as what's going to be in these next two fingers. So I'm going to go ahead and work up these next two finger openings. Then I'll meet you back to talk about how to do the index finger and the thumb. All right, I've just finished working up the finger openings here. So I've got the pinky, the ring finger, and the middle finger completely done. Now I'm ready to begin the index finger and the thumb openings. And what's great about these is that they are exactly the same way. You're going to be working them the same. It's just the only difference is the thumb is way down here, but the techniques are exactly the same as the index finger. So I'm just going to show you how to do it on the index finger, and then you should be equipped to be able to do both of these. The other thing is that these I find to be a little bit easier than the previous finger openings because there is no need for a chain to cut across. You're just going to be starting in the chain along the edge here, but then the rest of your stitches are just worked in regular single crochets. So I find that these last two finger openings are a little bit of a break compared to the ones that we just did. Okay, now to begin, we're going to do like we did with the others. We find the center stitches and we're going to insert our hook into the appropriate one. So because I'm right-handed, I'll insert it into the left side so that I can keep going that way. Then I go ahead and grab my yarn here. I'm going to pull it through to join, and then do a chain one to secure it. Once that's secure, I then will work my first single crochet into this chain. And then once I do that, I go ahead and grab my beginning of round stitch marker, and I'm going to place it into my first stitch. And there we go. All right. Then once I do that, it's just a matter of doing exactly the same thing we did on the previous fingers. So I'm going to work single crochets along the edge here. So I've got 4 more to do for the 5 that I worked earlier. So there's 2. Ooh. And just like the other fingers, this part starts off a bit fiddly. There's 3. And then there's 4. And then 5 for me. And then of course you're gonna do however many you've been doing this whole time. And then just like in the previous finger openings, when we want to go and work into the next single crochet right here, we're gonna have all this gap that we wanna cover. So just however many loops it takes, we're going to insert our hook and pull up some loops. So there we go. Okay, there we go. And then now I'm ready to work my single crochet into my next stitch. And there we are. Then once I do that, I am now ready to just continue working single crochets around. And like I said, we won't have to worry about doing any kind of chain or anything. So this is just a matter of single crocheting around. And then once I get to this opposite corner, I do the same thing that I did on these corners here, where I will do the, pulling the loop through and then working into those chains and then be able to continue around. So because I've shown all of that already, if you need any further support with these two finger openings, at this point you can now go back and just rewatch those, and they should be able to show you how to finish up the rest of these. Now, there are a couple of differences. Well, first of all, the similarity is that on the index finger, you're going to do a round, this first beginning round. Then you're going to do a second round of just normal single crochets. Then you're going to work your decrease round on the third round, just like we did on these ones. Then after that, you do the exact same thing where you just work up the length that you want for coverage and end with your slip stitch round. The difference with the thumb is you're doing exactly all of that, but I found that this didn't require any decreasing because our thumb is typically the thickest digit on our hands. So I found that it didn't actually need a decrease. It just needed to work a straight up cylinder, and ending with that slip stitch round was just enough to keep it nice and cinched without being too tight on the thumb. So with all of that, you actually have everything you need to be able to finish up this glove. And once you do that, you're then ready to just work your second glove and repeat all of those steps. And then after that, you are free to wash them, block them, and then wear them. And then you just got a nice, lovely pair of fingerless gloves for any time you just need that little touch of warmth. So with all of that, I think that that basically wraps it up for me. So if you found this video helpful and you want to make sure YouTube knows that you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And if you can, please feel free to go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell notification so that you are alerted anytime I put out a new video with another one of these pattern tutorials. In the meantime, I'm going to go finish working up my gloves and I'm going to see you in the next video. Thank you and have a wonderful day.